On March 15, 1991, Greyhound bus number 1847 departed from Flagstaff, Arizona, carrying 31 passengers into the desert night. The bus never arrived at its destination in Albuquerque, New Mexico. For 33 years, the disappearance remained one of America's most baffling mysteries. What the desert finally revealed in 2024 would prove that sometimes the most dangerous person isn't a stranger, but someone you trust completely. Marcus Webb had driven for Greyhound for 15 years. Colleagues described him as meticulous, a driver who never ran late and never broke protocol. On that evening in March, Webb completed his standard pre-departure inspection at exactly 6 in the morning. The maintenance logs showed nothing unusual. Everything appeared routine. The bus was scheduled to depart at 8:15 that evening, following the historic Route 66 through the Arizona desert. Webb had made this journey hundreds of times before. Among the passengers boarding that night was a woman traveling under the name Sarah Mitchell. She purchased her ticket with cash 3 days earlier. The ticket agent would later recall that she seemed nervous, checking over her shoulder repeatedly. What investigators would eventually discover was that Sarah Mitchell was actually Rachel Morrison, a 29-year-old accountant from Phoenix. Rachel Morrison was carrying something valuable, though no one on that bus could have known it at the time. Another passenger attracted no attention whatsoever. He boarded quietly, took a seat near the back, and kept to himself. His ticket had been purchased online using a credit card belonging to a man named Robert Vincent. This detail would have meant nothing to anyone except that Robert Vincent had passed away 3 months before the bus departed. The man using his identity was Vincent Torres, a 38-year-old who had walked away from a minimum security federal prison 7 days earlier. Dennis Holbrook wasn't supposed to be on bus 1847 that night. Holbrook worked as a relief driver for Greyhound, filling in when regular drivers needed assistance or when routes required 2 drivers. At 55 years old, Holbrook had worked for the company for nearly 2 decades. Colleagues considered him helpful, always willing to take extra shifts. On March 14th, just 1 day before the departure, Holbrook contacted dispatch and volunteered to assist Webb on the Albuquerque route. The dispatcher approved the request without hesitation. It seemed like a kind gesture from a dedicated employee. The last person to see bus 1847 was Carl Jennings, who owned a gas station at mile marker 73 on Route 66. Jennings had operated the station for 40 years, serving travelers crossing the desert. At 9:43 that evening, Webb pulled in for fuel. Jennings would later tell investigators that everything seemed normal. Webb appeared calm following his usual routine. Holbrook stepped out to stretch his legs and buy coffee. The passengers remained on the bus. Jennings processed the fuel transaction and watched the bus pull back onto the highway, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. That was the last confirmed sighting. At 11:47 that evening, Webb made his final radio check-in with Greyhound Dispatch. His voice sounded steady, professional. He reported their position between mile markers 89 and 127. The transmission quality was clear. Webb confirmed they were running on schedule and would arrive in Albuquerque by 2:30 in the morning. The dispatcher acknowledged and signed off. 60 seconds later, bus 1847 vanished from all communication systems. When the bus failed to arrive at the Albuquerque depot by 3 in the morning, the night manager attempted to contact Webb via radio. There was no response. He tried again every 15 minutes. Silence. At 4:30, the manager contacted local authorities. Initial assumptions centered on mechanical failure or a possible accident on the remote desert highway. Search teams departed at dawn, covering every mile of Route 66 between Flagstaff and Albuquerque. They found nothing. No bus, no skid marks, no signs of an accident. It was as if the vehicle had simply ceased to exist. The investigation expanded rapidly. Federal authorities joined local law enforcement within 48 hours. The FBI became involved due to the interstate nature of the case. Helicopters scanned the desert landscape. Ground teams searched ravines and gullies. Nothing appeared. Family members of the passengers gathered in Albuquerque, desperate for information. News coverage intensified. Theories multiplied. Some suggested mechanical failure had caused the bus to veer off the highway into a hidden canyon. Others proposed more sinister scenarios. But without evidence, investigators had only questions. 7 days into the investigation, a clerk processing passenger manifests noticed something unusual. The credit card used to purchase one ticket belonged to a deceased person. The discovery led investigators to Vincent Torres and his recent escape from federal custody. Torres had been serving time for fraud and identity theft. His disappearance from the minimum security facility had been reported, but no one had connected him to the missing bus until that moment. Suddenly, the investigation had its first suspect. Federal agents theorized that Torres might have hijacked the bus to avoid recapture. The theory gained traction when investigators learned more about Torres's background. He had military training. He understood weapons and tactics. His psychological profile suggested he was capable of desperate measures when cornered. The narrative seemed to fit perfectly. An escaped prisoner, facing years in federal custody, forces a bus driver to divert from the planned route. Something goes wrong. The situation escalates. Federal authorities devoted enormous resources to tracking Torres, but the trail remained cold. Torres had vanished along with everyone else on that bus. Then investigators discovered Rachel Morrison's true identity. Bank records revealed that Morrison had been employed as an accountant for a Phoenix investment firm. 3 weeks before the bus departure, $500,000 in bearer bonds had disappeared from the firm's vault. Morrison had access to that vault. She disappeared the same day the theft was reported. When authorities searched her apartment, they found evidence of a planned flight: a fake passport, cash in multiple currencies, airline schedules to South America. Suddenly, the investigation had a second suspect with a powerful motive. The theory shifted. Perhaps Morrison had hired Torres to help her escape. Perhaps they had worked together to take control of the bus and disappear across the border. Financial crimes investigators built a detailed case around Morrison's movements and provided detailed testimony about Webb's habits and routines. He shared his personal logs and schedules. He remained available for questions at all hours. His cooperation seemed beyond reproach. No one thought to investigate the relief driver who had volunteered to help. Months stretched into years. The case grew cold. Families held memorial services, though no remains had been found. Greyhound settled civil lawsuits. The FBI reduced the investigation to a skeleton crew. Theories continued to circulate in true crime communities, but no new evidence emerged. Bus 1847 had become a legend, a modern mystery without resolution. The desert kept its secrets. 33 years passed. In October 2024, a geological survey team was mapping erosion patterns in a remote canyon system 40 miles south of Route 66. The area was nearly inaccessible, surrounded by steep walls and hidden from aerial view by overhanging rock formations. Decades of flash floods had carved new channels through the landscape. One of those channels had exposed something metallic buried under layers of sediment and debris. The team investigated and made a discovery that would reopen one of America's most mysterious cold cases. Bus 1847 sat at the bottom of a ravine, partially buried but largely intact. The desert had preserved it in ways the investigators never expected. Federal authorities secured the scene immediately. What they found inside the bus remained classified, but sources close to the investigation confirmed that evidence pointed to a coordinated operation rather than a random crime. Every passenger had been accounted for. Forensic analysis would eventually reveal that a single type of weapon had been used. The precision suggested planning and cold calculation rather than panic or chaos. The discovery of Bus 1847 reignited the investigation with unprecedented intensity. Federal agents who had worked the original case were brought out of retirement. New forensic technologies that hadn't existed in 1991 were applied to the preserved evidence. The first breakthrough came from digital enhancement of the bus's onboard recording device, a primitive black box that Greyhound had installed in some vehicles as part of a pilot program. The device had captured audio from the driver's area for the final 2 hours of the journey. The recordings revealed Webb's voice, calm and professional, conducting routine communications. But analysts detected something else. Background conversations, muffled but discernible after enhancement. One voice appeared repeatedly, offering suggestions about route adjustments. The voice belonged to Dennis Holbrook. What struck investigators was the casual nature of these suggestions, as if Holbrook was guiding Webb toward a specific location without raising suspicion. At one point, Holbrook mentioned concerns about engine temperature, suggesting they take a detour to avoid straining the vehicle. Webb, trusting his colleague, agreed without question. Financial forensics uncovered another layer of the story. 3 months before the disappearance, Dennis Holbrook had accumulated gambling debts exceeding $2 million. The debts weren't to legitimate casinos, but to underground operations connected to organized crime syndicates. Records showed Holbrook had received multiple threats. His home had been vandalized. His ex-wife had been approached by unknown individuals asking about his whereabouts. Holbrook was a man under enormous pressure, desperate for a solution. The investigation revealed that 2 weeks before the bus departure, Holbrook had been contacted by federal authorities, not as a suspect, but as a potential witness. Holbrook had inadvertently witnessed a meeting between 2 high-ranking members of the crime syndicate while working a charter route to Las Vegas. The FBI saw an opportunity. They offered Holbrook protection in exchange for testimony. But the protection came with conditions. Holbrook would need to disappear completely, enter witness protection, and never contact anyone from his previous life again. Documents recovered from a sealed federal archive revealed the existence of Operation Desert Shield, though most details remained classified. The operation involved extracting a witness from a dangerous situation while maintaining absolute secrecy. The challenge was that Holbrook couldn't simply vanish. His disappearance would alert the syndicate that he had turned informant. They needed a cover story, something that would explain his absence without raising suspicion. The solution was as audacious as it was horrifying. The plan, as investigators pieced together, involved staging an incident that would make Holbrook appear to be a victim rather than a cooperating witness. The bus disappearance would serve as perfect cover. In the chaos and mystery, no one would suspect that one person had orchestrated everything. Holbrook would be presumed dead along with everyone else, free to start a new life under federal protection. But something went catastrophically wrong. Evidence suggested that Vincent Torres was never supposed to be on that bus. His presence was a coincidence that derailed carefully laid plans. Torres, desperate to avoid recapture, had chosen bus 1847 randomly, using stolen credentials to purchase his ticket at the last moment. When Holbrook realized an escaped federal prisoner was aboard, he faced an impossible situation. The operation couldn't proceed with Torres present. He would recognize a staged event. He might fight back. The controlled disappearance suddenly became genuinely dangerous. Rachel Morrison's presence added another complication. The bearer bonds she carried made her a target for anyone who discovered them. Forensic accounting revealed that Morrison had actually stolen the bonds to pay for her mother's cancer treatment, not for personal enrichment. She was fleeing not to escape justice, but to avoid being murdered by those who had discovered the theft. Her desperation made her unpredictable, another variable in an increasingly unstable situation. The audio recordings captured fragments of rising tension inside the bus, passengers asking why they had left the main highway, Webb questioning Holbrook's directions more insistently. At 11:45, 2 minutes before the final radio check-in, Holbrook's voice can be heard, saying something that chilled investigators. He said, "I'm sorry, Marcus. This wasn't supposed to happen this way." Webb's response was cut off by a sound that forensics experts identified as electrical interference, possibly from a weapon being discharged. Phone records revealed that at 11:50 that night, a call was placed from a satellite phone to a number registered to a federal agency. The call lasted 12 seconds. The content remains classified, but investigators believe it was Holbrook reporting that the operation had failed. Whatever response he received sealed the fate of everyone on that bus. The decision was made to proceed with the disappearance, but now it would be permanent, not staged. Analysis of tire tracks preserved in the canyon showed that the bus had been deliberately driven off the highway and down a series of increasingly narrow paths. This wasn't a panicked flight, but a methodical journey to a predetermined location. Holbrook knew exactly where he was going. He had scouted this location weeks earlier during a supposed camping trip. The canyon was perfect, invisible from the air, inaccessible to casual explorers, a place where secrets could be buried forever. The investigation uncovered evidence of a second vehicle at the scene. Tire tracks from a heavy-duty truck were found near the canyon rim. This vehicle arrived after the bus and left before dawn. Satellite imagery from 1991, recently declassified and enhanced, showed a heat signature consistent with a large vehicle in that area at approximately 3 in the morning. Someone had come to extract Holbrook and ensure no evidence remained that could compromise the operation. Carl Jennings, the gas station owner, remembered a detail he hadn't thought significant at the time. While Webb was fueling the bus, Holbrook had made a phone call from the station's payphone. Jennings assumed he was checking in with dispatch, but phone records showed no incoming calls to Greyhound that night from that number. Instead, the call went to a number that investigators traced to a shell company linked to Federal Witness Protection Services. Holbrook was confirming the operation was proceeding. The passenger manifest revealed another disturbing detail. 3 names on the list corresponded to people who had no family, no close friends, no one who would push for an extensive investigation. These weren't random travelers, but specifically selected individuals whose disappearance would cause minimal scrutiny. Someone had carefully chosen certain passengers, ensuring that at least some of those on the bus would vanish without causing lasting questions. But the plan hadn't accounted for the other 28 passengers. People with families, jobs, lives that couldn't simply disappear. The investigation suggests that Holbrook believed the operation would involve only moving the bus and the selected passengers to a secure location. The others would be released with a cover story about a hijacking or mechanical failure. When Torres and Morrison's presence made this impossible, the operation shifted from extraction to elimination. Forensic evidence from the bus revealed that all passengers had been sedated before the final events occurred. Chemical analysis found traces of a powerful anesthetic in the vehicle's ventilation system. This explained why there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of panic. The passengers simply went to sleep and never woke up. It was clinical, calculated, and utterly cold. The type of operation that required resources and planning beyond what any individual could manage. The investigation expanded to include federal agencies, but many records from 1991 had been destroyed or classified beyond the reach of even senior investigators. Freedom of information requests were denied on national security grounds. Key witnesses from federal agencies claimed no memory of Operation Desert Shield. Documents that might have provided answers were missing or redacted to the point of uselessness. The wall of official silence suggested that whatever happened in that canyon was part of something much larger. Dennis Holbrook's trail after 1991 was remarkably well hidden. Official records showed he died in the bus incident, but investigators found anomalies. His Social Security number was never officially closed. His federal employee identification was accessed 3 times in 1992 after his supposed death. A man matching his description was photographed at a federal facility in Virginia in 1993, though the image quality made positive identification impossible. If Holbrook survived, he had been given a new identity so complete that even dedicated investigators couldn't penetrate it. The revelation that shocked investigators most came from analysis of the bus's maintenance records. The mechanical issue that Holbrook claimed required a detour never existed. The engine temperature readings were normal. The supposed concern was pure fabrication, a lie told to a trusting colleague to redirect the bus toward its final destination. Webb never had a chance. He trusted Holbrook completely, and that trust was weaponized against him. The breakthrough that finally cracked the case came from an unexpected source. In 2024, a retired federal marshal named James Patterson contacted investigators after seeing news coverage of the bus discovery. Patterson had been involved in witness protection operations during the early 1990s. His conscience had troubled him for 3 decades, and the discovery of Bus 1847 finally pushed him to speak. What he revealed reframed everything investigators thought they knew about that night in the desert. Patterson confirmed that Operation Desert Shield was real, but its scope was far different from what anyone had imagined. Dennis Holbrook wasn't just a witness against a crime syndicate. He had been embedded within the organization for years, not as a criminal, but as a federal asset. His gambling debts were manufactured, a cover story to explain his desperate behavior. His job as a bus driver provided perfect cover for moving between cities, attending meetings, and gathering intelligence without arousing suspicion. The operation on March 15, 1991, was supposed to be Holbrook's extraction after 5 years undercover. The syndicate had begun to suspect his loyalty. His handlers decided it was time to pull him out. But they couldn't simply have him disappear. The syndicate would hunt him down, and worse, they would know their organization had been compromised. They needed something dramatic, something that would eliminate Holbrook from their world without raising suspicions about his true role. The original plan, Patterson revealed, involved only the 3 passengers without families. These individuals were actually federal agents who had boarded the bus to assist with the operation. The bus would be diverted to a secure location where Holbrook and the agents would disembark. The vehicle would then be hidden, creating a mystery that would dominate headlines and provide cover for Holbrook's disappearance. Webb would be compensated and relocated, given a story about a classified training exercise. It should have been bloodless. Vincent Torres destroyed everything. When Holbrook recognized Torres from federal bulletins, he panicked. Torres couldn't be sedated and relocated like a civilian. He would understand immediately that something was wrong. He might have weapons. He certainly had motivation to fight. Holbrook made a desperate call to his handlers, reporting the complication. The response he received remains classified, but Patterson suggested the order was simple and terrible. The operation had to proceed. No witnesses could remain. Rachel Morrison was collateral damage. Her presence with the stolen bonds added another layer of complication, but by the time Holbrook understood the full situation, it was too late to abort. The syndicate was already suspicious. Federal agents were in position. The extraction had to happen that night, or never. Morrison, like the other passengers, became an acceptable loss in a calculation that prioritized maintaining Holbrook's cover story above innocent lives. The sedative in the ventilation system was Holbrook's addition to the plan. He couldn't face what had to happen while the passengers were conscious. The chemical was provided by his federal handlers, a military-grade compound that would render everyone unconscious within minutes. Holbrook activated the system after the fuel stop, knowing that by the time they reached the canyon, no one would be aware of their fate. It was his last act of what he might have considered mercy. Patterson revealed that the second vehicle at the canyon was a federal extraction team. They arrived expecting to find Holbrook and 3 agents. Instead, they found a bus full of unconscious civilians and 1 escaped prisoner. The team leader made a decision that would haunt everyone involved. Rather than abort and risk exposure, they proceeded with making everyone disappear permanently. The methods used remained classified, but the result was clear. 31 people ceased to exist that night to protect a single operation. Holbrook was extracted and given a new identity so complete that even his fingerprints were altered through classified surgical procedures. He was relocated to a federal facility where he spent 6 months being debriefed about his 5 years undercover. The intelligence he provided led to dozens of arrests and the dismantling of a major crime syndicate. In the official calculation, his information saved more lives than were lost on Bus 1847. But mathematics couldn't ease the conscience of those who knew the truth. The cover-up that followed was extensive. Federal agencies destroyed records, created false leads, and misdirected investigations. The story about Torres hijacking the bus was deliberately planted to provide a plausible explanation. Morrison's theft was emphasized to suggest another motive. Every alternative theory that emerged was secretly encouraged to muddy the waters further. The families searching for answers were given just enough hope to keep them from looking in the right direction. What investigators found most disturbing was evidence that similar operations had occurred before and since. Bus 1847 wasn't unique, but part of a pattern of extracting assets at any cost. The desert canyon contained evidence of at least 2 other vehicles from different time periods. The scope suggested a systematic approach to making problems disappear. When inconvenient people needed to vanish, there were procedures, resources, and personnel ready to make it happen. The audio recordings revealed one final crucial detail. In the moments before Webb made his last radio check-in, he can be heard asking Holbrook a question. Webb asked why they were really going to the canyon. Holbrook's response was barely audible but devastating in its honesty. He said that sometimes good people had to do terrible things to stop even worse things from happening. Webb's last words, captured just before the sedative took effect, were simply asking about his family and whether they would be okay. Financial records eventually revealed the full extent of the payment system. Every federal agent involved in Operation Desert Shield received substantial compensation disguised as inheritance from deceased relatives or lottery winnings from tickets purchased by shell companies. Holbrook himself received nothing directly, but a trust fund was established for a person with his new identity. Over 30 years, that fund grew to over $10 million. Blood money for 31 lives. The investigation uncovered evidence that Marcus Webb had actually suspected something was wrong. He had left a note in his locker at the Flagstaff depot expressing concerns about Holbrook's recent behavior. Webb wrote that his colleague seemed nervous, distracted, unlike himself. But Webb's loyalty to a friend prevented him from reporting these concerns. He trusted that whatever was troubling Holbrook would pass. That trust cost him his life. The most damning evidence came from a classified report dated April 1991, 1 month after the disappearance. The report evaluated Operation Desert Shield as a qualified success despite the complications. It recommended procedural changes for future extractions, but didn't question the fundamental approach. The 31 casualties were listed as acceptable losses, given the value of the intelligence preserved. The report was signed by officials whose names were redacted, but whose positions suggested the highest levels of government awareness. Patterson provided one final revelation that changed everything. Dennis Holbrook hadn't died in witness protection, as investigators assumed. He was still alive in 2024, living under his 4th identity in a facility for retired federal assets. Patterson had visited him recently, finding a man destroyed by guilt but still protected by the system he had served. Holbrook had reportedly written a full confession, but it was immediately classified and sealed. He would never face justice for his role in the events of March 15, 1991. The families of the victims were eventually briefed on a sanitized version of the truth. They were told that their loved ones had been caught in a federal operation that went wrong. Compensation was offered with the condition of signing non-disclosure agreements, most accepted, exhausted after decades of searching for answers. A few refused and continued pushing for full disclosure, but their efforts were blocked by national security claims and bureaucratic obstruction. The discovery forced a reckoning within federal agencies about the cost of maintaining deep cover assets. New policies were supposedly implemented to prevent similar incidents. But investigators noted that these policies contained exceptions for extraordinary circumstances, language vague enough to permit almost anything if the stakes were deemed high enough. The system that created Bus 1847 remained essentially intact, ready to sacrifice more innocents if the calculation demanded it. The final piece of evidence was perhaps the most haunting. Among the personal effects recovered from the bus was a child's drawing created by a young passenger during the journey. It showed a bus traveling through the desert under a starry sky. In the corner, the child had drawn what looked like an angel watching over the vehicle. The innocence of the image contrasted sharply with the calculated evil that had destroyed its creator. The drawing was returned to the child's family, one of the few items that escaped classification. As the investigation concluded, the lead federal investigator made a statement that captured the horror of what they had uncovered. He said that Bus 1847 represented a fundamental betrayal of trust. The passengers had trusted the bus line to transport them safely. Webb had trusted his colleague. The public had trusted their government to protect rather than sacrifice them. Every level of trust had been violated in service of an operation whose benefits could never justify its costs. Dennis Holbrook remained in federal custody, not as a prisoner, but as a protected asset. Legal experts confirmed that prosecution was impossible given the classified nature of the evidence and the immunity agreement signed decades ago. He would live out his remaining years in comfort, protected by the same system that had enabled his crimes. The families of the victims would never see justice in any traditional sense. Their only satisfaction came from finally knowing the truth, even if that truth was more terrible than any of the theories they had imagined. The desert had kept its secret for 33 years, but erosion and time had finally exposed what was meant to stay buried forever. Bus 1847 became a symbol not of mystery, but of betrayal. A reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from criminals or escaped prisoners, but from those who claim to protect us. The 31 people who boarded that bus in Flagstaff had no idea they were pawns in a game whose rules they would never understand. They simply wanted to reach Albuquerque. Instead, they became acceptable losses in a calculation that valued information over innocence. The official investigation was closed in late 2024, with most details remaining classified. The government acknowledged that mistakes were made, but maintained that national security prevented full disclosure. The bus itself was removed from the canyon and destroyed, officially to prevent it from becoming a macabre tourist attraction, but more likely to eliminate any remaining evidence. The canyon was filled with concrete, sealing whatever other secrets it might have contained. The case of Bus 1847 was closed, but its implications would resonate for years to come. In the end, the greatest horror wasn't the disappearance itself, but the system that made it possible. The infrastructure of secret operations, classified budgets, and unaccountable decisions that could turn innocent people into statistics. Dennis Holbrook was the instrument, but he was wielded by forces that operated in shadows, making choices about who lived and who died based on calculations the public would never see. The passengers of Bus 1847 never knew they had been marked for sacrifice the moment Dennis Holbrook volunteered for that shift. The truth about Bus 1847 stands as a warning about the price of security and the cost of secrets. 31 people vanished not because of a crime or an accident, but because their elimination served a purpose deemed more important than their lives. Their families were left with a truth more painful than uncertainty. And somewhere, in a comfortable facility paid for by taxpayers, Dennis Holbrook lives with the knowledge that he helped murder 31 innocents to preserve his cover. He was never the hero of the operation. He was never even the villain. He was simply a tool in a system that could rationalize any atrocity if the paperwork was properly filed. The desert has returned to silence. Route 66 continues to carry travelers through the Arizona night. Buses still run the Flagstaff to Albuquerque route, though Greyhound retired number 1847 from its fleet. Most people have forgotten about the disappearance, moving on to newer mysteries and fresher tragedies. But for those who know the truth, every bus traveling through that desert carries the ghost of what happened when trust was betrayed and innocence was deemed expendable. The passengers of Bus 1847 deserved better than to become footnotes in a classified report. They deserved to reach their destination. They deserved to live. Instead, they became proof that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones our own government keeps.